So, welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So, this is episode 70, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Paul Ghio, who's currently the director of product at Yelp. So, prior to Yelp, Paul led product at Autodesk, Creative Market, and HomeAdvisor. So, had some really incredible experience leading product at top marketplaces. So, this is a really great group chat that we just had with Paul, where we dove into some of his past experience, specific product insights and learnings, and also had a great group Q&A for those that were on the chat. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Paul, welcome to the group chat, and it's definitely great to have you join us here today. So it's
Yeah, it's great to
not
be
every
here.
day. Yeah, so it's not every day that we get to have someone, with your product background and experience join us. So I'm excited to learn more about all of your great experience leading product at some marketplaces like Autodesk, Creative Market, HomeAdvisor, and then now at Yelp. Before we jump into things, I think it'd be great if you could start off by maybe sharing a little bit more on your background for those that don't know you.
Yeah, for sure. Hey everybody, I'm Paul. I'm currently a director of product right now at Yelp, and I'll get more into that experience in a little bit. But on a high level, I've been working on marketplaces across a variety of stages for the last 9 or so years. So I've worked at kind of marketplace startups, and I've actually raised venture capital for marketplace. I've helped scale marketplaces where I joined Creative Market as employee 14. And then more recently at both Yelp and HomeAdvisor have been at marketplaces at scale.
That's awesome. So let's go back to the early days. So like, what actually led you in to your initial interest in the marketplaces?
Yeah, so really early on, and this is actually prior to that 9 year period, I just saw an opportunity within a particular industry that I didn't fully pursue, but it got me interested in marketplaces. And the opportunity was suppliers and folks on the demand side were not connecting that easily. And so I was trying to figure out how might I solve this. I started talking to people in the industry. Granted, I was in college at the time. I was quite young, and so I didn't necessarily know what I was doing. And that led me to the concept of marketplaces. And then if we fast forward a little bit, I joined Autodesk / Creative Market. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, as really my first kind of marketplace. So I was technically employee 14 at Creative Market, but I joined them as they were being acquired by Autodesk. So I was technically joining Autodesk, even though the majority of my kind of time and energy was spent working on Creative Market. So I was with Creative Market for about 3 or so years, and then we actually ended up spinning that company out of Autodesk and going fully independent again and raising around and technically becoming a Series A startup, even though we were a little bit further along. So yeah, I just had that early fascination. And I think, the interesting thing that I ended up kind of figuring out about marketplaces is that from a data perspective, very intricate, especially if you think of a marketplace like Yelp that's operating at a massive scale across so many different categories and has more or less 1 in 3 Americans going to be using the product on a monthly basis. And then other things like network effects, of course, bring pretty high barriers to entry, which is interesting. And having no inventory, assuming it's not a managed marketplace, means things, it's cheaper to operate, it's easier to scale. And those are all kind of fascinating attributes.
Going back to Autodesk and then kind of Creative Market, could you share a little bit more about what you were working on then and maybe some of the kind of initial product challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question. So early on, I was kind of brought in, again, like employee 14, so wearing multiple hats, but I was brought in to be both a growth PM and an analyst. So at that point in time, they didn't have a concept of a product team or even a PM, nor did they have an analytics person or team. And so I really helped kind of stand up a lot of that infrastructure there. And by kind of setting up a lot of the infrastructure, I help kind of better understand kind of marketplace dynamics. And so Creative Market, if folks aren't familiar with the site, is a marketplace for design assets. So think of like design ingredients, things like fonts, 3D models used in animation gaming, templates, graphics, stock photos is kind of the legacy category that a lot of people know about within the stock space. And at Creative Market, we had to start 5 high-level categories, and then we eventually expanded to 7 high-level categories. And within those categories, there are sometimes dozens of subcategories. And so some of the early work that I was doing was just to kind of set up really foundational metrics, trying to better understand things like user retention. Again, the team was quite young. We didn't have a good understanding there, so established that. then started to try to understand the inputs of user retention. So how many people are actually hitting what is known as like the aha moment, how many people are building a habit around that. So we established that for both sides of the marketplace, similar to like the Facebook 7 friends in 10 days, and started working against that. And then started to better understand the nuances across categories and the more or less the liquidity needed within each category. So what I mean by that is, if you take a category like fonts, we probably, when I started, had a catalog of about 5,000 products, and that actually was pretty sufficient to create a match so that most buyers could actually find what they were looking for. But there's other categories where the needs of the buyer were much different. So if you take a category like stock photos, oftentimes when a freelancer, designer, solopreneur is looking for something like a stock photo, they have a pretty particular idea of what they want in mind. It can be as specific as the St. Bernard running along the lakeside at high noon with plenty of white space and all that. And as a result, what we started to understand was that we needed a much deeper catalog in those areas. And so we started treating more or less each one of the categories, in some cases subcategories, as almost unique marketplaces, and kind of measured things like match rate and conversion rate, and buyer or transaction to catalog depth ratio. So that's some of the stuff I was working on a high level. I'll quickly just kind of touch on some of the future stuff, and we can go in there if it makes sense. But kind of moving forward, I ended up overseeing kind of the entire growth and marketing team. So growth being kind of product-driven growth, a lot of experiment and optimization, kind of focused on a lot of the early findings that we had within kind of my first year as I got things established. And then marketing was all things top of funnel. So think SEO, we built out a homegrown affiliate program, did some paid acquisition, et cetera. And then eventually oversaw everything from design and research to product, as well as growth and analytics.
Awesome. There's definitely a lot there, and some that we're going to jump into. I'd like to, such as like categories, kind of with Yelp a little bit later in the chat. But transitioning from there. So I believe you then joined HomeAdvisor.
Yeah, so I was with Creative Market for 5.5 years. It was a great journey. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, we ended up spinning the company out. It actually led to the company's second acquisition. It was acquired by Dribble, if anybody's familiar with kind of that site within the design space. And then from there, took a little bit of a hiatus. Over that 5.5 year period, there was a lot of turmoil, I think good turmoil, but it was kind of exhausting. I was a little burnt out. And then I ended up joining HomeAdvisor, which is a verticalized marketplace within the home services space. And there I was really focused on trying to better align incentives between our suppliers and the business.
Awesome, man. Could we go a little bit deeper on that?
Yeah. So HomeAdvisor operates across the United States and operates across, I think, 1,100 or so different job types. So it's a place you can go to find everything from a roofer to somebody to clean your pool to someone to build you a custom home. And one of the challenges that HomeAdvisor had was actually a supply constraint, which is really unique, I think, in the marketplace space. Most marketplaces have a demand constraint, and that's been pretty consistent with all the marketplaces that I've worked on, have helped with, et cetera. But they had a supply constraint, and we dug into why is that the case? And a lot of suppliers, can't go into specific numbers, but a lot of suppliers were churning out after a short amount of time on the platform. And effectively what we found is that they more or less felt like they weren't getting good ROI on the platform. And they felt like they were trying to get leads, and a lot of these leads weren't actually turning into hires and turning into work. And so we went down a path of exploring ways that we could better align incentives. And effectively what we did was we moved the monetization event further down the funnel. So in the kind of traditional marketplace, the way that it would work is a business would pay for a lead, and we would kind of sell that lead to 4 businesses. And of course, if you're, let's say, a custom home builder, or you're looking for a custom home builder, you're only going to hire one of those folks if you're going to hire anybody at all. And so oftentimes you have this scenario where people are paying hundreds of dollars for a lead, doesn't manifest to work, kind of creates a bad perception about kind of the quality of the customers coming off the marketplace, and then they churn out. And so what we decided to do was experiment with giving leads out completely for free, allowing the business to pick and choose the leads that they wanted to interact with based on things like location, availability of their calendar, skill set, et cetera. And then we would try to monetize when a transaction was actually completed. So we actually had our own payment system, and we would more or less take a take rate, started at 5%, just universally across the board of all transactions going through the system.
That's really interesting. So I'm actually kind of curious, with maybe some of the unique challenges of testing monetization at that kind of sense of scale and maturity for a marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, the big challenge is leakage, as you might imagine. So big challenge was that we knew that there was transactions happening that weren't going through the HomeAdvisor kind of payment system. And so immediately, once we identified that that truly was a challenge, and we knew that was going to be a challenge going into it, or at least we hypothesized it was, we started messing around with different mechanisms to keep people on the platform. So we did things both on the consumer as well as on the business owner side. On the consumer side, one of the things that we did, just to give an example here, is we rolled out something called the HomeAdvisor Guarantee, which effectively guaranteed the outcomes of a project that a homeowner was engaging with. And we knew from research that a lot of homeowners have anxiety and fear about kind of hiring the right person, ensuring that that person's actually going to show up, ensuring that the work that they get done is actually the work that's needed, that they're not getting ripped off, or getting sold something that's not actually needed, if it's especially for something like a repair. And so we offered this guarantee to help protect consumers. And that really gave a pretty strong incentive to consumers to stay on platform. And then on the business side, we effectively created terms so that we had to see kind of payment go through for them to continue to play in the system. So we did that. We ended up actually working with a lot of our sales reps to introduce onboarding and education so that business owners were aware of this new business model. Because one of the things that we discovered early on is that this business model was very new within the industry. And even though we felt like we had adequate messaging throughout the product, a lot of these businesses simply just didn't comprehend kind of this change. And so we had to kind of take a little bit more of a manual approach early on to both educate business owners and also to learn, to then kind of bake some of those learnings back into the product.
And out of curiosity, like what are some ways that you were able to learn and kind of get that feedback and then take that into the product?
Yeah. So I mean, there was two main avenues. One was just kind of quantitative data. So operating at a pretty massive scale, like HomeAdvisor does operate at, we were lucky enough to have decently robust tracking and a decent volume of data. And so we were able to do everything from kind of like from building out funnels to actually collecting kind of more quantitative feedback within the product. And then in addition to that, I was actually hopping on the phone with homeowners and business owners twice a week. So it's every Monday and Friday afternoon. And we just call them up and talk to them kind of generally about how they operated their business, or generally how they search for projects and got projects started, in addition to kind of specifics. So specifics around payments. How are you actually paying? What is your preferred payment method? Why is that your preferred payment method? And then we had a pretty small but talented internal research team. So we spun up, I want to say like 3 different research studies, kind of studying various aspects of this product and kind of attitudes and behaviors as they're related to the product. And then of course, as I mentioned a little bit ago, worked with a lot of the sales folks and the support folks to get feedback in that way. So we were lucky enough that we had support to get a lot of user feedback early on that helped us obviously better understand what was happening.
That's great. So all these marketplaces are, very different and highly nuanced, but are there any kind of, key similarities or traits that kind of that they share that make them great marketplace businesses and successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if I think about the traits of a healthy marketplace, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is fragmented supply. And something that is true of Yelp as well as HomeAdvisor, and then Creative Market is all the marketplaces had pretty fragmented supply, Granted, within creative market, you did have kind of the 80-20 rule on the supply side where you did have some whales, but even if you kind of aggregated the whales or added up kind of the percentage of sales that the whales accounted for, it was still like a single digit percentage. So that is kind of one big one. There's some things that make some of these marketplaces like a bad marketplace. And maybe that's where the next question's going.
We can go there too. So
yeah, I would say not common across all of them, but a challenge that we currently face at Yelp, and we definitely faced at HomeAdvisor, was the fact that for a lot of these high frequency categories, so think categories like pool cleaners, house cleaners, landscapers, those categories are very prone to monogamy, where the initial kind of matchmaking, the initial transaction can happen on platform. But then once you as like a homeowner find a cleaner that you really like, oftentimes you will just continue to book through that cleaner and you don't have a need to go back to the platform to find a brand new cleaner. And so like that's a challenge, again, that both these last two marketplaces that I've been at have faced. We're starting to think more and more about that at Yelp. And luckily we have a lot of other categories at Yelp specifically that don't necessarily have that behavior.
yeah, that's a great kind of transition into Yelp. So like what led you to initially joining the Yelp team?
Yeah, I think part of it was the opportunity, the scale. So as I mentioned a little bit ago, more or less 1 in 3 Americans use Yelp on a monthly basis. And so, we're operating in a massive scale and we're also operating at a massive breadth. So we have so many different types of businesses, even though a lot of people think about Yelp from a restaurant-centric point of view. We also have everything from nightlife to beauty to auto to home services. And of course, we operate across all geos within the United States. And so just like the scale provided a really interesting opportunity. And then I think that paired with the fact that home services specifically, which is one of kind of the 2 focus areas that I oversee, it's a very painful process from a user perspective. Like, I don't know if you're a homeowner or if you ever kind of book any of these services, but the time that it takes to go from, hey, I have an idea of what I want to do, and that even assumes that you have an idea, to I've actually hired somebody, can be quite lengthy. And we have a lot of kind of research to support this, but it can be a multi-week journey, and it's painful, and there's not good information transparency throughout this process. And to maybe put it simply, it's not similar to an Uber where you just like press a button and a car shows up. And given that, I think there's a lot of opportunity to remove friction out of that process, make it easier for both parties, both the home service providers and other service providers, as well as the homeowners, to just get to that higher point as easily as possible. So that over the next few years, I think will be interesting to see how obviously Yelp develops and the industry develops as a whole.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get into some of the specifics here in a little bit. So I think a lot of us have experienced, Yelp from the user side as far as restaurants, but could you maybe give us like a high level kind of overview and breakdown of it as a business more?
Yeah. So effectively, I'll put it in like really kind of simple terms. Effectively, there's like restaurants and there's everything else. And a big part of everything else is home services. And where Yelp makes a lot of their money is actually in home services. Restaurants don't really advertise to the same degree on a kind of per restaurant basis. They're not worth as much to Yelp. And so there's a large push right now to actually go into home services and ensure that we both have kind of marketplace liquidity across all these various categories and all these various geos, as well as to kind of evolve the experience again on both sides of the marketplace, so that it's for a consumer, it's really simple to kind of understand where to start, how much something should cost, what you even need to do, because owning a home is complicated and it's challenging, and people sometimes don't even know where to start. And then once you figured out all that stuff, how do you kind of get go to 0 to 1 as fast as possible? And then on the business side, we're just building a lot of tools to help businesses get hired and get hired faster, and hopefully in the future get hired with almost little effort as needed. So going back to the original question, kind of that high level breakdown, restaurants and everything else is a good way to think about it. Trying to think what else I can kind of share here, because a lot of that stuff I just shared is obviously publicly available. I'll say Yelp is concentrated in some geos more so than others. And so one of the big things that we're focused on right now is trying to get certain markets to look like other markets. So I'll just name two arbitrary markets. How can we get Orlando, Florida to look just like San Francisco from kind of a supply and demand perspective? So there's a lot of work going into that as well.
Yeah, so that's actually something I wanted to chat about, which is the kind of managing liquidity across various markets and having so many categories. So maybe how do you think about that as far as as a marketplace?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, especially since relative to some of the more vertically focused marketplaces, we actually have a small team. I mean, people probably think of Yelp and think it's a massive company, and it is a pretty large company. But the number of people who are dedicated to home services is quite small. And the nuances between a lot of these home service categories or job types, if you will, is very different. Just to give an example here, if you are locked out of your home and you need a locksmith at 2 a.m., like that use case and that kind of workflow is very different than if you're building kind of a custom home, up in the mountains. And so the approach that we're taking right now is trying to more or less raise all boats, where we're trying to kind of improve the experience kind of holistically. But then there's certain categories, higher volume categories, call it like the top 5% of categories or 10% of categories, where we're really trying to go deep and really kind of understand some of those nuances and cater the experience a little bit more towards the specifics of those categories. Maybe obvious, but another thing that we've started to look at more recently is kind of understanding liquidity across all cats and geos. So there's massive spreadsheets. We're effectively trying to understand, do we have enough traffic in all these geos? If we have enough traffic, do we have enough quality businesses? If we have enough quality businesses, are we monetizing enough of those quality businesses? And then if we have all three from there, how do we think about kind of pushing the experience to make it easier? So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So how do you how do you think about prioritizing a category? Say, for instance, identifying the top 5 categories, and we can kind of speak in like an abstract, with
Sure.
this example, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for us, we're of course looking at traffic and how much inbound traffic is in those top 5 categories. We're looking at the number of businesses as well as the number of advertisers in those categories. And then we're also, I mean, really simply put, like we're just looking at conversion rates too, and trying to understand, what is the average conversion rate for something like a home services category across Yelp? And that's really a conversion from a session to a project created. And then within these top 5 categories, what is this conversion rate? And there's a few other kind of slices and segments that we put on things, but keeping it fairly abstract and not getting myself into too much trouble. That's more or less how we look at it.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing with us on that. So you did mention a relatively small team. So what is the kind of product team and org structure like?
Yeah, so at Yelp, there's a few different groups. There's a group dedicated to restaurants. Obviously, I'm not as involved in that group, but they're really focused on what Yelp is known for and arguably Yelp's bread and butter. And then services it's a single group, but it's actually spanning 2 different orgs. It's a little complicated, but effectively we have, let me think here, we have about 9 or so kind of product teams working on services, which again might seem like a lot. I know in kind of a past life that seemed like a lot to me, but those 9 product teams are sometimes going against these verticalized competitors that have 3x the number of product teams really focused on services, and sometimes those teams get really specialized. And then it's a very cross-functional group, so marketing and product are very interwoven, along with, of course, design, engineering, and data science.
Got it. Yeah, I was interested to learn more about how specialized the teams were across the kind of categories too. So you're the director of product. So like, what are your primary roles and responsibilities, and maybe even kind of like day to day like?
Yeah, so I think day-to-day shifts a lot. But I can talk about kind of day-to-day in this moment. I should say beyond home services, the other thing that I'm focused on is what we just call the core business owner experience. So how do we get businesses onboarded to the business product? How do we get those businesses to kind of experience value early and often? How can we build new tools to help those businesses succeed and make better decisions and hopefully grow and find success both on Yelp and outside of the platform? So that's another area of my focus. But in a given week, if I was to average it out, at least during this period of time, there's a few different things that are happening. So we have kind of regular team meetings that are happening across both of these groups. So it would be everything from kind of a regular weekly meeting where we're talking about what shipped, what is about to ship, some of the high level learnings that we had from that week. We also have readout meetings where we'll talk about experimentation results. We'll share research findings in those meetings. More recently, we've been going through, for lack of a better phrase, like these little mini design sprints as we're kind of exploring the problem and solution space in a few areas. And then right now, I'm very heavily involved in annual planning because Yelp is a public company. Annual planning, as you might imagine, is quite important to the company. And so we both have to have a really good sense of kind of the bigger problems, user-facing problems, and kind of marketplace dynamic problems that we want to tackle over the next year. And then eventually we need to kind of map that to kind of impact and kind of project that out to the street so that people, so, you know, Yelp has accurate projections and people know how to think about the trajectory of the company.
Certainly. And, I'm also curious to learn, are there any kind of unique challenges with, being a remote team? I'm assuming you're fully distributed and remote right now.
Yeah, yes, we are. We are. So Yelp is headquartered in San Francisco. I am not in San Francisco. Moved out of the Bay Area about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm in Denver now. And the team is fully remote, and Yelp is actually committed to going fully remote going forward. So they're fully embracing kind of the remote work. For me, I mean, I think the unique challenges are just not having enough kind of face time, that serendipitous face time with folks where you're walking to get lunch and you're talking through ideas. Creativity and some of these workshops that we're doing, these design sprints, can be challenging, although there's great tools like FigJam that help facilitate some of this. That said, I'm a little bit biased because I've been working in a remote environment or a partially remote environment since 2014. So going all the way back to Autodesk and Creative Market, the team was both partially co-located in San Francisco, but then we had folks distributed across the entire US. We actually had somebody outside of the US. So I'm very kind of comfortable in this sort of environment. That being said, I miss being around people, and I haven't seen people or worked with people in quite a long time. And I think the weirdest thing has been I haven't actually met anybody in person that I've worked with for 2 years. Arguably, or obviously because of COVID, but really excited to fly out to San Francisco and actually meet some of these folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we can, most of us here can, of course, relate with that. So definitely. So Zoom will do for now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you have some really incredible experience, leading product at some of these top marketplaces. So do you have any kind of like tips or key learnings that you would like to share with early stage marketplace founders that might be helpful?
Yeah, if my Yelp experience might not be as relevant. I think there's aspects that are relevant, but if I think back to like my creative marketing experience, that was very much kind of early stage startup. I think one of the things that took us a while to really figure out is understanding specifically where the constraints were within the marketplace. I think we had a high level sense of, yeah, we're demand constrained, and so we should focus on demand. But kind of going back to some of the stuff I was saying earlier, it took us a while to build that more nuanced view of on a per category basis, on a per subcategory basis. If we're just looking at sans serif fonts to make something up, like where is the constraint and how do we proactively solve for that, both with product and with marketing? So I think there was that. I also think, kind of reflecting back on that experience, there's more we could have done earlier in the process to really identify kind of the red hot center, and really identify like where the marketplace was working quite well, and focus more of our attention there in some cases. I think we, at one point, we maybe spread ourselves a little bit too thin, and there was a few categories that were really working quite well, and arguably we could have doubled down on more. And so I think that was a huge kind of takeaway. I'm trying to think what else. Maybe stating something that's a very apparent thing, but at the end of the day with marketplaces, the thing that matters the most is liquidity. I remember hearing about how much money Craigslist made, and Craigslist is obviously a very under-optimized product, very under-optimized business model. And I think they, as of fairly recently, they were still generating like $1 billion a year. Sorry about that. My computer just out of the blue completely died on me and will not power back up. So not sure what's happening. But the last tip that I may have gotten kind of cut off when I was talking about was just liquidity matters. And kind of going back to that example that even some of these marketplaces that a lot of us would maybe look down upon from a user experience perspective can still do a decent amount of revenue, and that's because of liquidity. So that's the thing to get right early on. And everything else in my mind is kind of icing on the cake.
That's super helpful. So you did mention something that's come up a few times that I actually wanted to go into a little bit more, which is kind of identifying the red hot center, right? So could you maybe share a little bit more about that and kind of what you mean, and maybe some ways to do that, as marketplaces in the earlier stage?
Yeah, for sure. So what I mean by the red hot center is where are kind of buyers and sellers kind of alleviating a really, really strong pain point and connecting on the platform to a really strong degree. So you might see, I'll go back to the creative market example, 7 high-level categories, like hundreds of categories if you take into account all the subcategories. What we saw was that there were certain categories that just had conversion rates that were much, much higher. We had certain categories that had buyer and seller retention at a much higher rate as well. And so like those were indications that those areas of the marketplace were working, and those areas continued to work for a while. And what we ended up actually finding was that we would acquire a lot of users in these categories that I would deem kind of part of a red hot center. And then they would eventually discover other areas in the marketplace and kind of branch out and discover some of these other categories. So these other categories they were secondary, if that makes sense. So as it relates to identifying them, I would be looking at kind of conversion rates in those categories and kind of benchmarking that against kind of the marketplace average, as well as conversion rates in other categories. And I think retention is a really key metric for buyers, given kind of the natural kind of behavior there, the natural usage frequency, how often are they buying? So at Creative Market, we typically measure things in a monthly basis. So how many people are making a purchase in a given month? And then for sellers, we looked at retention as well. But the key stat there, the key way that we measured that was what percentage of our sellers are actually uploading new products and contributing to the marketplace within a weekly or quarterly basis, depending on the category.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks for sharing with us. I feel like you and I could go on for quite some time. So we're going to jump into group questions because we have a few that want to come on, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, sounds great.
Cool. Hey, Davey, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Paul. Very interesting. I got also like 1,000 questions to ask you, so I'm just going to try to limit myself to 3. But if there's a chance to ask more, then I have a lot for you. So I just pick up some specific element that you mentioned, and I just wanted to go a bit deeper on it. So the first one is you talking about user retention. So with all your experience, have you noticed any technical feature that you implemented into marketplaces that actually increase or boost the user retention rate?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think a lot of the stuff that we did was really helping people find success early on. So I think for retention as a general statement, the most critical period is within their first X days or X months, depending on the marketplace and the frequency there. So from a product that should be used on a more high frequent basis, retention is probably going to be measured in like days or weeks as opposed to months, and vice versa. And so going back to Creative Market, once we defined what kind of the aha moment was, and so for us, it was a seller getting their initial sale. And that was the moment where they're like, hey, I'm actually getting value out of this marketplace, and I have dollars in my bank account that wouldn't have otherwise been there. And then beyond that, once we identified at what point do we need to get those sellers to build a habit around that moment. So for us, we needed, as a general statement, if we looked at all categories, we needed to get sellers to $50 of gross sales within 30 days of their first upload. And then from there, a lot of it was just ensuring that they had the right tools, the right understanding, kind of the right communications to get them to that point. I'll go specific with one feature. It's a really simple feature, and it actually made a pretty decent impact. When a seller would get a sale prior to implementing this feature, we would send a really generic kind of transactional email just saying, hey, you got a sale. And we ended up like modifying that email so that it was more of a kind of celebration. We said, hey, congrats, you got your first sale. Here's some tips and tricks to keep going down the process. And we actually saw, it wasn't like massive, but it was, I think, a 16% increase in products that were uploaded within 7 days of that first email going out. And so there wasn't like one huge unlock. It was just a lot of these little things over time that continued to stack and continued to help improve that retention on the seller side in this one example.
All right. Thanks a lot. Super interesting. Mike, can I just go up? I have two other questions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. All right. The other one is you mentioned, I'm just checking my notes now, but you mentioned the SEO affiliate program to boost up like the marketplace. Can you tell me more about it? How did you set it up? What was the traction that you get from it? What was the result that you managed to achieve?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the early insights that we had was that a lot of the sellers on the platform, and this is of course at Creative Market, also ran blogs, or they would have some sort of social presence, specifically in the design space. And so we saw that as an opportunity to convert some of these sellers into affiliates. And so we ended up building out this program where it's changed a little bit, but initially what we would do is give out 10% of every customer's purchase that they made after being referred to Creative Market for an entire year. And so we built out the program. We really leveraged our network of sellers to kind of get the kind of early adoption of the program, and sellers ended up actually always constituting as the majority of the participants in the affiliate program. And then over time, we ended up kind of building more and more tools for them to help them promote. So we created dedicated communications. We created dedicated features on the site so that they could embed things like products. And we had this concept of a collection, which think of it similar to like a Pinterest board where people can kind of collect assets, typically around some sort of theme. And so we would allow our affiliates to be able to embed some of that stuff on their personal sites. And what ended up happening as an output of a lot of this work was our affiliate channel was the second largest customer acquisition channel for Creative Market. So SEO was the top. I know for a lot of marketplaces, SEO is a very important channel. It definitely was for us, and we spent a lot of time there. But affiliate was a very strong number two.
Awesome. That's a great question. Hey, Davey, do you want to share a little bit more about your marketplace and what you're working on? Because I think it might be helpful since it's relevant to Creative Market.
Yeah, sure. It's probably also a bit different though, but I'm creating a marketplace that connects artists with customer, and basically to provide custom art. So we're gonna draw custom portrait based on the customer demand, basically. So it's a art on demand, custom art on demand. So there's a lot of stuff that you probably have seen that I try to get the best of, because I know that I can implement some specific part and try to grow as well. That's the idea as well. So.
Oh, nice. Awesome. Yeah. If you ever want to connect kind of one-off, I'd be happy to kind of chat more specifically and learn about kind of what you're trying to do and the challenges you're trying to face. And if there's anything relevant in my past, happy to try to impart some of that advice.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to end up with one last question, Mike, and then I'll just leave it there. Regarding all the acquisition technique that you have implemented, which one was the most efficient? So you talk about those two ones, but is there other ones that you have implemented and actually surprised you by the outcome that you've been able to achieve with it?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're asking about is maybe, where did we get the highest ROI for the least amount of work as it related to customer acquisition? And there's definitely an example here that I don't know. I like this example a lot because I think it illustrates, the concept of like leverage and getting a lot for a little quite well. So when I first joined Creative Market, this is going back to 2014, where I was both operating as a growth PM as well as owning kind of analytics kind of end to end. One of the things that I discovered was that users who were coming back from Pinterest were worth 9 times more from an LTV perspective. Not even coming back, I should say, who were discovering us from Pinterest and visiting the site from Pinterest were worth 9x more than the next highest social network, which I think was Facebook at the time. And it was a really interesting insight. It was really surprising, at least at that point in time. I think it makes sense in retrospect. So what we ended up doing was we took a look at the site, and on our product profile pages or product listing pages, we had, I think, call to actions for 5 or 6 different social networks. So this is 2014. We had things like Google Plus on there and Twitter. I think Tumblr was there. But anyways, we were trying to get users to share our products that were very visual in nature across to all these different networks. And we ended up running a very simple experiment that we effectively developed in a morning, where we said, what would happen if we just limited optionality here? And we just gave users a single network to share to. And of course, that network was Pinterest, just given the results. And we did that, and it ended up probably being the most successful single thing that I've ever done in my entire career, was just reducing 6 buttons down to 1 button and focusing on Pinterest. But we ended up increasing GMV from social channels as a whole, so across all these channels, by it's like 450%. We ended up making social as a channel a really big channel for us. So Pinterest was always kind of number 3 or number 4 channel. And this kind of set off a whole slew of work to ensure that our assets were being kind of promoted to Pinterest and at a higher rate, in a better way. We started encouraging our sellers to actually develop these very long vertical images that at least at the time, I'm sure it's still the case, would do quite well on Pinterest. And so we started, using our sellers rather to help us create the content that would do well there. So that was like the most surprising thing. And again, in retrospect, it totally makes sense. It was a site for, creatives and designers selling, kind of these custom, very visual pieces of work. And that obviously kind of fits with kind of Pinterest and that medium quite well.
Thanks a lot. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a really great example. So thanks for sharing that with us, Paul.
Yeah, of course.
Hey, Colton, do you want to jump on?
Sure. Yeah. Paul, earlier you were talking about research teams and how, part of your daily activities as a head of product would be doing those readout sessions. And to give a little bit of context, I run a marketplace for IT support, and we're at that stage now where we're post MVP, kind of post that version 1.0 of the product. And I was just wondering if you had any advice for, maybe some stepping stones into building more of a research focused development team. Because like as of now, whenever we do our sprint planning sessions, it's a lot of, hey, we think this is going to be very valuable for people and don't have a ton of hard data and would like to make more of our focused around actual research being done and something more that's just in the minds of us and through the meetings that we're having. So wondering if you had any kind of stepping stones for a startup, that's post that first initial product, and also might not have tons of resources where I can just go out and immediately hire a full, research team and have the development team to back that up.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's definitely a process to get there. So again, I think the Creative Market time, just given the fact that it was, a smaller team, startup is quite relevant. When I first joined, We had no research team. We didn't even have a concept of research. Nobody was really talking to users. And we had a lot of internal theories and assumptions about who our users were, how they behaved, what their motivations were, what the use cases were, et cetera. Some of those over time ended up being right, and some of them, as you might imagine, ended up being wrong, and in some cases very wrong. And so where we started was, it was actually me kind of in the head of growth and marketing role, partnered with kind of a marketing specialist on my team. And we just went out and started talking to users. Like, it was honestly like that informal. And to be honest, like, I didn't have any formal training at that point in time. I eventually, I think I read a book. I think it was Lean Customer Development as part of the Lean series, which had some useful kind of tips and tricks in there. And I ended up kind of learning more about how to conduct research effectively. But at the time, we just started talking to users, and going through that process, we started to realize that a lot of the assumptions were likely wrong about our users. And from there, we actually had an individual who was a community manager for us. And great guy, super ambitious. And he ended up actually kind of stepping into like this partial research role. And then eventually he became kind of a dedicated researcher. But he didn't have a formal background in this space. He ended up just kind of self-learning. And through him, we ended up kind of building a formal program that way. At times too, we did partner with an external agency, actually on 2 separate occasions, to help execute some of the research. I don't think that's necessary, but it can be another avenue to explore. So I would say, as a headline, just start small, start scrappy, just start talking to users. And then there's somebody on the team who can, dedicate some percentage of their day or their week to this. I would definitely explore that as well.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. That was a great question. Hey, Paul, so I actually had a question for you myself. And, so you've obviously have some pretty incredible experience at some of these, marketplaces. So how has maybe your product kind of philosophy and approach, maybe changed over the years?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it definitely has changed over time. I think when I first started, I was incredibly data-driven, and that was just a byproduct of being both a growth PM and the owner of analytics. And users was something that was very secondary or tertiary if it was on my radar at all. And granted, like, I was able to, still have a lot of success being very data-driven and just looking at funnels and kind of understanding where there's discrepancies, or just making kind of intuition calls as to when I thought something could be better optimized, et cetera. But over time, as I actually got deeper into research, as I started talking to customers, I really realized that a lot of my success, and really all the success I had at that point in time, had some sort of kind of user component underlying it. So if we go back to that Pinterest example, of course, over time, we started to try to dive into that, better understand what was happening. And there was a few different use cases there and a few different motivations for people sharing to Pinterest. And obviously we didn't know that at the time, and we just kind of stumbled into it. So if we fast forward to today, I'm very heavily user driven. I think I have 3 kind of core values for the product teams that I run. And one of them is just user proximity, and ensuring that everybody, regardless of your level, is hopping on the call with users, is being part of these research readouts, and is really taking kind of a user-centric point of view when developing our product. And one of the things that people on my team kind of know me for is always pushing back when I don't understand how a given solution or a roadmap item is benefiting the user. So that's one huge kind of massive change. Obviously, like, I was rooted in data initially, and marketplaces are, throw off a lot of data, and data is very fundamental to being able to understand what is actually happening. And so I still have a very strong data bent to me, but that is secondary to kind of that user understanding. And then I would say, in addition to that, the things that I really try to foster on my teams is speed, just speed to validation. I think especially within some of these larger environments, you can get teams that are a little bit complacent and they're not necessarily shipping as fast. And coming from that smaller, scrappier experience. I'm very biased towards kind of speed being a competitive advantage and trying to figure out how do we get the learnings we need as fast as possible. Sometimes that's shipping, sometimes that's through research, sometimes that's through building prototypes and just getting it in front of users and seeing how they interact with it. And then a third one is just having really high agency. I think, the best people, the best teams have high agency, and they kind of fight through adversity, and they find a way to get something done, even in environments where there's imperfect resources. And believe it or not, even in an environment like Yelp, we don't always have what we need to get things done. Sometimes product is growing at a faster rate than one of our complementary or adjacent teams like data science. And therefore, ideally we have a data scientist to figure out the optimal pricing on a per job level, on a per geo level. But sometimes we don't have that. And so we have to get really scrappy about how we actually launch things and kind of accomplish things just to help facilitate that learning.
Yeah, that's really great and helpful. It's also great to hear about, Yelp being scrappy too, even the scale it's at. Since
yeah, I mean, I can't speak for every team, but I'll speak for the teams that I'm helping with.
Certainly. So cool. This is a really great chat. And once again, I appreciate taking the time to join us. I did have one kind of last question for you. Is there
Sure.
maybe one thing that you've kind of learned through your experience that might be, kind of counterintuitive to what's often said about marketplaces, or kind of a misconception?
Oh, I mean, maybe this might be a cop-out answer, but maybe going back to that thing that I was mentioning earlier, that they're all customer constrained or demand constrained. That like going into HomeAdvisor and realizing that we were supply constrained was like a huge learning for me. Because, had you asked me prior to that point in time, is there such a thing as a supply constrained marketplace? I'd say like, sure, but it would be isolated to parts of the marketplace. But HomeAdvisor was just constrained across the board. So I don't know if that's really a great answer, but that was a surprising thing for me.
Well, this is great. So yeah, I really appreciate taking the time to join us, because you have some pretty incredible experience. So last but not least, right before we wrap things up, where can we keep up with you? Time for a kind of quick plug.
Yeah, for sure. So my Twitter is just PGHIO, so Paul, and then my last name Ghio. I'm not very active on Twitter, but anybody here can reach out to me. I'm always happy to have one-off conversations. I think marketplaces are fascinating, so I love just learning about what other people are trying to do. So there's that. And then if you want to reach out to me via email, you can do that as well. So just pg@paulghio.com. And again, happy to help anybody here, because I know how challenging it can be to get a marketplace off the ground and get that early liquidity, and then how challenging it can be to kind of find ways to scale that. So
awesome. That's great. Yeah. So once again, yeah, thanks for taking the time to join us, and thanks everyone for the great questions.